Greetings. This is Lawrence Holgate, the host of Understanding Plato, and the author of the textbook of the same name. Today's episode, episode 7 in the series, is about the dialogue that Plato called Meno. It's the fourth book in the Socratic dialogue series. If you recall, the first three were Euthyphro, Apology, and Crito. Meno is the fourth of the 5 dialogues that Plato wrote about those days prior to the execution of Socrates. The central character in this dialogue is Meno. He's an aristocratic young man from northern Greece. The only other character who briefly speaks is Anytus. He's one of the accusers, if you'll recall, who brought the prosecution against Socrates. The theme of this dialogue is virtue. Meno wants Socrates to tell him how virtue is acquired. Is it acquired by teaching? Is it acquired by practice? Or do we acquire virtue by nature? Socrates gives a typical response. He says that he cannot know the answer to Meno's question because I do not know at all what in the world virtue is. He asks Meno to provide him with a definition. He says, "What do you think, Meno? Let's go from there." Well, Meno makes several attempts to define virtue, some of which are similar to Euthyphro's failed attempts to define piety. Meno's first attempt at definition is familiar. He gives a list of virtues for different kinds of people. He talks about the virtue of men, the virtue of women, the virtue of slaves, the virtue of children, and Socrates immediately responds that a list or an enumeration of persons to whom the concept of virtue applies is simply inadequate. And he gives a definition of defining what it is to be a bee, B-E-E. Suppose I asked you about being a bee, what a bee is, and you said that bees are many and multifarious. Well, what would you reply if I asked you, do you mean that they are many and multifarious and different from one another just in being bees? Or do they not differ at all in that, but in some other way? For example, in beauty or in size or some other such way? And Meno says, well, they differ at all from one another just in being bees. Socrates then persuades Meno that what is wanted is information about that thing itself, in which they, the bees, do not differ but are all the same. And so it is with virtues. Even if they are many and multifarious, surely, they all have one identical form because of which they are all virtues. What he's looking for is what he was looking for when he was talking to Euthyphro. He wants to know what is essential to being a bee and what is not essential. Suppose, for example, I ask you what a triangle is. What is essential to being a triangle and what is not essential? What is not essential is clearly not color. For example, I would not say that all triangles have to be white. That would be obviously false part of the definition. If I said that all triangles are three-sided, now I've hit on something we can go with. We can talk about that which they all have in common, all triangles. And so it is with virtue. So Meno provides Socrates with an account of the one identical form or definition that he believes will work. And here's what he says. Virtue is the ability to rule. Well, Socrates asks Meno if he will accept the following modification. Virtue is the ability to rule justly, because ruling unjustly could not be virtuous, any more than ruling in a cowardly or an intemperate way could qualify as virtuous. Meno accepts the modification, but Socrates immediately points out that this makes the definition circular. After all, justice is a virtue. If we replace the word justly with the word virtuously, then Meno's definition of virtue would look like this. Virtue is the ability to rule virtuously. Obviously, we're not going to go for that. It tells us nothing. By the way, a circular definition is a definition in which the term to be defined is used or implied in the definition itself. So, virtue is the ability to rule virtuously. Virtue is being defined with the very term it is attempting to clarify, and we don't want that. Meno makes a second attempt to define virtue by refashioning a quote from an unnamed poet. Here's the quote: "Virtue is to desire beautiful things and have the power to get them." I'll repeat that. Virtue is to desire beautiful things and to have the power to get them. Socrates convinces Meno to change the word beautiful to the word good on the ground that the desire for a beautiful thing is surely a desire for something good or beneficial. Second, since no one wants bad things, because bad things are things that make us unhappy and no one wants to be unhappy, everyone will want only good things for themselves. Everyone will want good things for themselves. In this respect, we are all the same. Hence, it could not be this, the desire for good things, that makes us virtuous. If it did, then no one is better than anyone else. That is, everyone would qualify as equally virtuous. Well, this is an unacceptable result because it conflicts with Meno's belief that not everyone is virtuous. Well, this puts the emphasis on the second part of Meno's definition. The second part of the definition is that virtue is the power to get good things. If one person is not better than another with respect to his or her desire for good things, then virtue must have to do with differences in their power to acquire good things for themselves. And Meno agrees. Meno says, "I think getting gold and silver is good, and also honors and public offices in the city. These are all good. Getting gold and silver is good. Getting honors is good. Getting public offices in the city, that's good. But now the trap is set. Since the acquisition of gold and silver can be done either justly or unjustly, Meno is forced to admit that virtue is getting good things with justice." Once again, Meno commits the fallacy of circularity. He uses that which he wants to define in the definition. Here's what Socrates, in a scolding way, tells Meno. "I begged you just now not to break virtue into pieces or exchange it for smaller coins. I even gave you models of how you should answer, but you pay no attention to that. And tell me that virtue is getting good things with justice. And justice, you say, is part of virtue. It follows, then, that doing whatever one does with a part of virtue is virtue. For you say that justice is a part of virtue." Well, we go on. Meno has to get through all of these different definitions, and Socrates keeps coming back to the same point, that you're trying to use the very thing you want to define in the definition. That violates the principle of circularity, the logic principle of circularity. So after a long digression about the possibility of inquiry, Socrates grudgingly agrees that he will investigate by hypothesis the question whether virtue is or is not acquired by teaching. His consent to do this is grudging because he does not think that any question about virtue can be answered until we first find out what virtue is. The hypothesis he investigates is virtue is some kind of knowledge. He formulates the first part of his argument with a hypothetical. He says, if virtue is some sort of knowledge, it clearly would be acquired by teaching. That's what teachers do. They try to teach their students what is known. Socrates makes short works of this hypothesis, though. I'm going to give it to you in argument form. Try to follow carefully. If you have the book in front of you, of course, you can follow as I read. But it has 5 steps. It's a very simple argument. Step 1, if virtue is knowledge, it is acquired by teaching. Hypothesis. If virtue is acquired by teaching, this is step 2. If virtue is acquired by teaching, then there are teachers and learners of virtue. Step 3. But there are no teachers or learners of virtue. Step 4. Therefore, virtue is not acquired by teaching. That follows from steps 1, 2, and 3. Step 5. Therefore, virtue is not knowledge. That's the conclusion. And the argument is valid. That is, if we accept the first 3 premises, 1, 2, and 3, then we must accept steps 4 and 5. We must accept that virtue is not acquired by teaching, and we must accept, therefore, that virtue is not knowledge. That the argument is valid in the sense of validity that we already discussed. If you recall, an argument is valid when it's the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion is also true and cannot be false. But are the premises true? Is all knowledge acquired by teaching, as stated in premise 1? Premise 3 is also questionable. Premise 3, there are no teachers or learners of virtue, that's an empirical claim. And as such, it needs to be supported by observation and experience. Socrates doesn't believe that there is any evidence, though, that good men, whether now or in the past, also know how to pass on to someone else this virtue that makes them good. There's lots of good people, he says. Now there are good people. There were good people in the past. But we can't say, we don't know that it's true that they know how to pass what they know, on to someone else. Can they do that? Socrates is doubtful. He attempts to prove premise 3, there are no teachers or learners of virtue, by giving examples of famous Athenians and contemporary educators for hire, the sophists, they're called, who claim that they can teach virtue to young people. In all of these cases, Socrates says that these so-called teachers not only disagree among themselves about whether virtue can be taught, but they are not even agreed to know it themselves. They all give different definitions. We should note that Socrates is not saying that it's logically impossible that there are any teachers or learners of virtue, but only that there is no empirical basis for believing that such persons exist. He hasn't found any. It's possible that he might find someone. He hasn't rejected the possibility, but he says we just do not know right now that there are any such people. Well, I'm going to end this at 12 minutes, this podcast number 7. We're going to go on to an entirely different subject. We're still going to stay in the Meno, but the last part of the dialogue is the one that people really puzzle over. It's the connection between knowledge and true belief. We'll discuss that in podcast 8. Thank you for listening. If you want a copy of the book from which I am reading, go to Amazon.com. Just plug in my name, Lawrence Holgate. Lawrence is spelled with a U. Holgate is spelled with a U. Houlgate. And put in the title, Understanding Plato, and you'll go right to that Amazon page where you can get either a digital copy of the book or a print copy. Thank you for listening. See you next week.